What obligations do recipients of Justice Department funding have to provide services to limited English proficient LEP persons? This training segment provides an overview of the obligation that recipients of Justice Department funding have under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, or Title VI, as well as under Justice Department program statutes, not to discriminate on the basis of national origin as it relates to providing services or benefits to individuals who are limited English proficient, or LEP. Title VI applies to all recipients of financial assistance from the Justice Department, whereas each program statute applies only to recipients of financial assistance under that statute. In addition to other civil rights protections, Title VI and the Department of Justice program statutes prohibit recipients of federal financial assistance from the Justice Department from discriminating on the basis of national origin in the delivery of services or benefits. One form of national origin discrimination can be discrimination against an individual based on the individual's limited English proficiency, or LEP. A limited English proficient, or LEP person, is a person who has a first language other than English and has a limited ability to read, write, speak, or understand English. This definition has evolved over time, beginning with a 1974 Supreme Court decision, Lau v. Nichols, where the Supreme Court indicated that failure to provide adequate language assistance in public schools constituted national origin discrimination in violation of Title VI. In 2002, the U.S. Department of Justice issued guidance to recipients of federal financial assistance on Title VI prohibition against national origin discrimination affecting LEP persons. In that guidance, the Department of Justice provided examples to federally funded organizations about how they can structure their programs to ensure that they are providing meaningful access to LEP persons to the program's services and benefits in a non-discriminatory manner. According to the Justice Department's guidance, a federally funded organization must, 1, take reasonable steps to ensure meaningful access to the programs, services, and information it provides free of charge, and 2, establish and implement policies and procedures for language assistance services that provide LEP persons with meaningful access. In a moment, we will consider what reasonable steps a recipient must take to make its services accessible to LEP individuals. In determining whether a recipient of federal financial assistance is providing meaningful access to its programs for LEP persons, it might consider whether the LEP person is able to understand the services and benefits that are available, whether the LEP person is able to communicate effectively the relevant circumstances of his or her situation, and whether the recipient organization is able to communicate effectively with the LEP person. A recipient should not charge an LEP person for the language services it provides. An LEP person should not have to pay an interpreter or translator to access the recipient's services. The Justice Department's guidance offers a 4-factor analysis to help recipients assess what reasonable steps they should take in providing LEP persons with meaningful access to programs, services, and information. The 4 factors are as follows. First, a federally funded organization should determine the number or proportion of LEP persons served or encountered in the appropriate eligible service population. The greater the number or proportion of LEP persons served or encountered in the appropriate service population, the greater is the need for language services. Typically, the appropriate service population is persons who are served or encountered in the geographic area that has been approved by a federal grant agency as a recipient's service area. This is not, however, always the case. For example, the appropriate eligible service population for a large metropolitan police department that serves many different LEP communities may be each precinct, whereas the appropriate eligible service population for a rural sheriff's department may be the entire county. Second, A federally funded organization should determine the frequency with which LEP individuals come in contact with the program. The greater the frequency of contact, the greater the need for language services. For example, it would be reasonable for a funded domestic violence shelter that has frequent contacts with Spanish-speaking LEP individuals to have ready access to Spanish-speaking interpreters to help with the intake process. Third, a federally funded organization should determine the nature and importance of the service or benefit provided. The more important it is, or the greater possible consequences to LEP individuals if they do not have access to the program, the more likely language services are needed. For example, the obligation to communicate rights to a person who is arrested or to provide medical services to an ill or injured inmate differs significantly from the obligation to provide language services for a bicycle safety course or recreational programming. There may be times when the importance of the service being provided trumps all other considerations. For example, regardless of the language demographics of the eligible service area or the frequency of contacts with a particular language group or the cost involved in obtaining competent language access services, providing an interpreter to an LEP person who is being prosecuted for a capital crime would undoubtedly outweigh other considerations. Fourth, a federally funded organization may take into account the resources it has available and the cost it will incur in providing language access services. There is no one way to provide meaningful access to federally funded programs and activities for LEP individuals. What constitutes reasonable steps for a large federally funded organization may not be reasonable where small federally funded organizations are concerned. The Office for Civil Rights is aware that for many recipients, resources for providing language access services may be limited. The cost of securing language services is, however, only one of the 4 factors used in analyzing the reasonableness in making services accessible to LEP individuals. Resources alone are also not the determining factor. In assessing the resources a recipient has to provide language access services, it is especially important for recipients not to think of resources only in terms of dollars. There are many cost-effective ways for recipients to provide LEP persons with meaningful access to programs, services, and information. Some examples include sharing language assistant materials and services with other service providers, training bilingual staff to serve as interpreters and translators, sharing information with industry groups and associations, using telephonic and video conferencing with access to interpreters, standardizing documents to reduce translation needs, or using qualified community volunteers. Once a recipient has analyzed the 4 factors described above, the recipient needs to decide what language services it will provide. There are 2 primary types of language services: oral language services, or interpretation, and written language services, or translation. Interpretation is the act of listening to something in one language and orally rendering it into another language. Translation is the replacement of a written text from one language into an equivalent written text of another language. When a federally funded organization provides oral language services, it should consider the following issues and options. The recipients must have some method for determining that the interpreter is competent. Competency requires more than self-identification as bilingual, although it does not necessarily mean formal certification as an interpreter. Additionally, some recipients, such as courts, may have additional requirements for interpreters. When recipients often encountered certain languages, hiring bilingual staff, especially in public contact positions, may be a good and economical option for providing interpretation. It is important to remember, however, that being bilingual does not mean that a person is competent to interpret. The recipient must still have a method for testing the competency of its bilingual employees. Telephonic interpreter service lines allow recipients to access quickly interpreters for many different languages. Using community volunteers may be an economical way to provide language services. However, as with other interpreters, the recipient must have some method for ensuring their competency. The Justice Department strongly discourages the use of family members, friends, or others, such as inmates or bystanders, as interpreters. Nonetheless, an LEP person should be permitted to use a family member to interpret if he or she wishes. The recipient should carefully consider issues of confidentiality, privacy, conflict of interest, and reliability before using such informal interpreters. Even if an LEP person insists on using an interpreter whom the LEP person provides, the recipient should still determine independently whether the circumstances warrant the recipient's relying on its own qualified interpreter. Recipients should exercise extra caution when a minor is being put in the position to serve as an interpreter, regardless of whether this is the LEP person's choice. As a matter of policy, recipients should avoid using minors as interpreters. The recipient should always inform the LEP person that it can provide a competent interpreter at no cost. When translating written documents, there are two questions a recipient should consider. First, what documents should be translated? And second, into what languages should documents be translated? The Justice Department guidance suggests that recipients translate vital written documents into the language of each frequently encountered LEP group eligible to be served or likely to be encountered. Whether or not a document or the information it solicits is vital generally depends upon the importance of the program, information, encounter, or service involved, and the consequence to the LEP person if the information in question is not provided accurately or in a timely manner. Examples of vital documents include consent forms, written notices of rights, prison handbooks, applications to participate in a recipient's programs, and notices of disciplinary action. The language spoken by the LEP individuals with whom the recipient has contact should determine the languages into which it translates vital documents. Many organizations would like to ensure with greater certainty that they are complying with their obligation to provide written translations in languages other than English. The Justice Department guidance has a safe harbor provision. Although complying with the safe harbor provision is not a requirement, doing so constitutes strong evidence that a recipient has met its obligation under Title VI and other federal laws in providing written translations for its LEP service population. Under the Justice Department guidance's safe harbor provision, the following actions are strong evidence of compliance. The recipient provides written translations of vital documents for each eligible LEP language group that constitutes 5% or 1,000, whichever is less, of the population of persons eligible to be served or likely to be encountered. If there are fewer than 50 persons in a language group that meets the 5% threshold, the recipient does not need to translate vital written materials, but it does need to provide written notice in the primary language of the LEP language group of the right to receive competent oral interpretation of those vital written materials free of cost. The U.S. Census Bureau has many resources available online that can assist a recipient in understanding the language demographics in its service population. The census files provide some information on the size of the resident LEP population, which may, for some recipients, be important information relevant to conducting the four-factor analysis or determining the languages into which it will translate documents to meet the safe harbor provision in the Justice Department's guidance document. You may visit the website of the U.S. Census Bureau at www.census.gov. After completing the four-factor analysis and deciding what language assistance services are appropriate, a recipient should develop an implementation plan to address the identified needs of the LEP populations they serve. According to the Department of Justice's guidance, a language access plan should incorporate 5 elements. First, a process for identifying LEP persons who need language assistance. A recipient may incorporate the first 2 factors of the 4-factor analysis into its language assistance plan, gathering data on the language demographics of its service populations, and tabulating the frequency of contacts with LEP beneficiaries. Second, information about the available language assistant measures. An effective language access plan should include information about the ways in which a recipient will provide language assistance. For instance, federally funded organizations may include in their plans information on the types of language services provided, how its staff can access the services, how to respond to LEP callers, how to respond to written communications from LEP persons, how to respond to LEP persons who have in-person contact with staff, and how to ensure competency of interpreters and translators. Third, training for staff. All staff members should receive training on the recipient's language access plan, knowing in particular their shared responsibility under federal law to provide services to LEP individuals. Staff members in public contact positions need to know how to interact effectively with LEP persons. They should know how to identify the primary language of an LEP person. They should be able to access quickly an interpreter, regardless of whether the interpreter is a qualified bilingual colleague, a professional interpreter, a qualified volunteer, or a telephonic interpretation service. Staff members should be familiar with the vital documents that a recipient has available in translation and to provide these documents to LEP persons as needed. Staff members should also learn to work with an interpreter, respecting the neutral role of the interpreter while speaking directly to the LEP person. Fourth, notice to LEP persons. It is important that federally funded organizations let LEP persons know that language services are available free of charge. This information should be provided in the languages LEP persons will understand. Examples of notifications may include posting signs in intake areas and other entry points, stating in outreach documents that language services are available, working with community-based organizations and other stakeholders to inform LEP persons that language services are available, issuing notices in local non-English newspapers, television stations, and radio stations, and distributing notices at schools and houses of worship. Fifth, monitoring and updating the LEP language access plan. It is important that organizations periodically update their language access plan because communities and language demographics are constantly changing. A plan may reflect the needs of a community's LEP population today, but the needs of the community's LEP population may be significantly different in just a few years. For additional information on a recipient's responsibility to provide services to LEP individuals or for technical assistance in developing a language access plan, you may write to the Office for Civil Rights, Office of Justice Programs, U.S. Department of Justice, 810 7th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20531. You may contact the Office for Civil Rights by telephone at 202-307-0690, by TTY at 202-307-2027, or by email at askocr@ojp.usdoj.gov. Additional information is also available on the website of the Office for Civil Rights at www.ojp.usdoj.gov/OCR or at www.lep.gov.